Okay, I think we should try and make a start, and then we can admit more people as they arrive. So welcome everybody, it's great to see you all. I hope you've all been enjoying the conference so far. As you all have noticed, this workshop is in a different format to the others you've been watching so far, and this is because we'd like to offer you all a chance to chat with other early career researchers in small breakout rooms later on in the session, and to discuss some of the presentations that you'll be hearing about in the first part of the session. So to start with, we're going to hear 3 presentations looking at the experiences of early career researchers during the COVID-19 pandemic. First, we'll hear from Emily Marsay, who will present the findings from her report published today on COVID-19 and the inequalities and impact on early career researchers. Then we'll hear a pre-recorded presentation from Dr. Nicola Byrom on the mental health impacts of COVID-19 on doctoral and early career researchers. Finally, Elena will present the work she's been doing with a group formed in reaction to COVID-19 called Pandemic PGRs. So after we've heard from Emily, Nicola and Elena, you'll have a chance to ask a few questions before we go into the breakout session. So please do jot any down while you're having a listen. So I think we should dive straight in. So Emily Marsay will be presenting first. Emily is a PhD researcher in the School of Social Science and International Studies at the University of Exeter. And she is also a researcher at the Women's Budget Group. So I'll hand the floor to you, Emily.
Hi, thanks for that introduction. It's so great to be here today. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see that? Perfect. So today's presentation, I'm going to be launching the report that I was writing with the Women's Budget Group, which is on the impact of COVID-19 on inequalities in academia. While this is predominantly looking at the gendered impact of COVID-19 on early career researchers, we did find that it actually exacerbated lots of pre-existing inequalities, not just relating to gender, but also relating to race and disability. And I think this really links to what Daisy May was saying earlier, in that in times of crisis, pre-existing inequalities are exacerbated. And this has certainly been the case with COVID-19 colliding with a sector, academia, which has been marked over the past decade with precarity, as it has been marketized as a sector and neoliberalized. There's been more casualization of contracts, and more academia as a sector is being marked by inequalities, by a burgeoning mental health crisis, and by precariousness, especially for early career researchers. So we're having a look today at how these impacts have manifested themselves. So this study was commissioned by Sarah Rees, Director of Research and Policy at the Women's Budget Group. And this was because there was a concerning reduction in the research published by women since the onset of the pandemic. And we really wanted to see the reasons behind this. Okay, so why was there beginning to be a reduction in research published by women since the onset of the pandemic? So the methodology, at the beginning of summer, we created a survey which was distributed among this early career network, as well as many other doctoral training partnerships across the UK. So thank you very much if there was anyone in this call, in this webinar, who actually did participate in that survey. It's really appreciated. And also a big thank you to my 20 interviewees. So I did 20 semi-structured qualitative interviews as well, which are then transcribed before being written up into this report. So the key challenges that were found for early career researchers since the onset of the pandemic can be categorized, I suppose, into 5 key themes. And following these challenges, we're then going to touch upon the key impacts upon women ECRs or early career researchers. So these 5 key challenges, whilst these will have applied to all early career researchers, they are gendered, and they will exacerbate existing inequalities in the following ways. So casualization, as statistics from the Higher Educational Statistical Analysis released every year has shown, while women and men enter university at an equal level. In fact, there's actually more girls than boys entering university at undergraduate level. When you get to higher up positions in academia, that equality falls by the wayside, and men actually hold a lot more of the permanent positions and non-fixed term contracts in university. So the casualisation and the precariousness of contracts is something that is gendered. And obviously the caring responsibilities, the uptake of caring responsibilities since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic is also something that is gendered. So while we're looking at these 5 themes, keep in mind that it's something that is likely to be gendered, even though it will impact all early career researchers. So the first theme is casualisation. So there were problems since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, which have been caused by this casual and last-minute nature of work that was already a problem in academia. So as pandemic PGRs we'll highlight later, the University College Union were already in negotiations with universities over this fixed-term nature of contracts and over the 0 hours contracts that many early career researchers are on. The problem with this type of contract when the pandemic hit was that due to a reduction in funds for many universities due to their funding model, it meant that there was what has been termed a bonfire of casual contracts, which has disproportionately hit women early career researchers, as well as Black and minority ethnic early career researchers and disabled people disproportionately, as they are the ones predominantly on casual contracts. So as this quote by an anonymous survey respondent says, women of colour disproportionately hold precarious contracts and are therefore some of the hardest hit by the pandemic. Another key theme was that postgraduate researchers feel treated neither as students nor as staff. So whilst paying students are treated as customers in the current neoliberalised model of university, and staff are obviously have some working rights, PGRs slip between the cracks and they feel that they have been left off mailing lists, they are unsure about future workload, they're not being communicated or respected as a member of staff, and also because they don't have a real contract, a proper contract, instead they're either self-funded or on a government stipend. This means there's no eligibility for government support, which means that they're not eligible for furlough, despite the fact that many cannot continue with their research under lockdown. They're also not eligible for tax-free childcare, which many working mothers need. And it's also affecting the ability of PGRs to claim any sort of redundancy payments if they do have their contracts cancelled because of the pandemic. And so this quote by one of my interviewees really demonstrates the impact this has on graduate teaching assistants, or GTAs. So in one university, it was said that there'd be a 15% cut to all faculties and all graduate teaching assistant employment would be stopped. However, in normal employment law, you would actually have the right to redundancy pay if you have 2 years of service. And this was something that was not considered at all for the graduate teaching assistants in this university. They were not considered to have normal working rights in that manner. So another key theme that was raised was workload and working conditions. There was an exacerbation of long working hours, with many respondents saying that they were working well into the morning, well into the night. Then women were taking on more of the emotional labour and their unpaid academic housework. This is things which are not actually contributing to research progression or career progression, but which often falls on women's shoulders. The switch to online teaching was also gendered, in that more women take on the teaching roles in universities, which means that this switch to online learning and that exacerbation of workload was impacting women more than men. And finally, there's also been obviously a big increase in caring responsibilities. So this really links to the talks earlier about that contradiction between social reproduction and also the ability to do your productive labour in the workforce as well. So the increase in childcare led to a vast reduction in hours available to work on research for early career researchers from home. But not just that, but we heard stories, unfortunately, of people's elderly relatives passing away due to COVID-19, people catching COVID-19 themselves, and also relatives. And living at home has generated a massive increase in housework unrelated just to childcare or homeschooling, but also related to, everyday living. It has just living in the home constantly has really exacerbated that housework, and this is gendered and impacting on people's ability to conduct research as well. And this is all exacerbated by a lack of support. So unfortunately, many of the respondents to our interviews and our surveys did say that they actually faced some quite sexist comments from male colleagues or supervisors, saying things such as, well, you can't have your cake and eat it, in regards to having children and also being a researcher, or not being given support to work from home as a normal worker would, you know. So despite there being, for instance, health and safety tests, which you're supposed to do for your working at home environment, these were not followed up with any actual support if your work from home environment was not deemed to be safe. And especially for postgraduate researchers who are non-UK residents, who depend on their student or staff status to remain in the UK, this uncertainty regarding future employment and a lack of support has actually led to some having to leave the country. Now we're just going to quickly move through the impacts of all these challenges, particularly upon women early career researchers. And these can be categorized into mental health, physical health, and productivity impacts, which eventually coalesce to lead to potentially many women researchers having in the future might be dropping out of academia because of this mental health, physical health, and productivity crisis. So this quote sums it up quite neatly, I think, of one of our anonymous interview respondents, that not just physically and emotionally, but also financially, they have found the pandemic to be exhausting. So what was highlighted in our survey and also in our interviews that was that early career researchers were not just feeling stressed, they were also feeling really guilty about balancing priorities, feeling really uncertain about future working conditions. We've found that previous mental health conditions have been exacerbated. So many of our survey respondents reported feeling an adverse impact of the pandemic upon their mental health, which is also backed up by the SMaRteN study, which will be presented by Nicola in a moment, which also found that 88% of respondents from their large-scale study found that respondents experienced at least moderate mental distress. Next is physical health. So existing health inequalities, which are reflected throughout society related to gender, disability and race, will be reflected in the early career researcher population as well. And these have the potential to transform into more permanent inequalities in research and in academia if it impacts on early career researchers' ability to conduct their research. So one example of this is an interviewee said she was so unwell from COVID-19 for a good couple of months, it knocked at least 2 months out of her research. So this is a way in which physical health inequalities are going to be reflected in the early career researcher population, and also not just as a consequence of COVID-19, but also from isolation and the impacts of mental health. These will have an impact on physical health as well. And finally, productivity. So this comes full circle to the reason why this paper was commissioned, I suppose, was to understand that drop in productivity, or for want of a better word, you know, the lack in production of research by women academics. This is because their time available to conduct research has gone down. And when they do have time to conduct research, they really struggle with concentration. And that means that their quality of work is going down, and they're working throughout the night, they're feeling guilty, they're feeling burnt out, which is a non-sustainable level of work. So despite their ability to work going down, the productivity required of them is still extremely high. Which is leading to feelings of burnout. And this is non-sustainable if we want to have an equal academia sector. So we've got 10 recommendations here. I know I'm out of time, sorry. So I'm literally just going to whiz through these, and you are able to find these in the report that we've just launched on our website today. So thanks so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions after this. Sorry for running over.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Emily. That was fascinating research and really interesting to hear the different experiences, and also, yeah, the recommendations which are in the report, which I posted the link to in the chat. So next we're going to hear from Dr. Nicola Byrom, who is a senior lecturer in psychology at King's College London. Nicola is the principal investigator on the Student Mental Health Research Network, or SMaRteN study, and will tell us a bit more about the mental health impacts of COVID-19 on doctoral and early career researchers. Unfortunately, Nicola couldn't be with us today, but she has pre-recorded a presentation which my colleague Hannah is going to share with us now. I think we might be having some problems with the sound on that one. So perhaps what we should do is go to Elena first, and then we might come back to Nicola's if we can afterwards, if that's okay. Okay, fantastic. So Elena will be telling us a bit more about some of the work she's been doing with pandemic PGRs. Elena is a PhD student at the University of Sheffield, working on civil-military relations. She's also part of the local UCU branch anti-casualisation group and is active in many PGR campaigns. So over to you, Elena.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks so much for this event, and also inviting me to talk about pandemic PGRs. So that group organized around an open letter addressed to the major funding bodies and the ministers of education and the government in the first phase of lockdown, like back in March, demanding a UK-wide strategy for PGRs, including funded extensions of at least 6 months for all PGRs being provided, and also being having an equivalent to be provided for self-funding PGRs during the first lockdown, and especially for the reason that because of the precarious status of PGRs, they were not eligible for furloughing, but all university services were shut down, and PGRs were told to continue their research, even though most of the ethics panels of universities said like face-to-face research will not be is basically cancelled, and most institutions have not been going back from that, I think, since March. So face-to-face research isn't happening. All the while, they have been demanding that meaning the universities, that PGR research goes on. Their initial policy, most institutions' initial policy for PGRs was to take a leave of absence, which is entirely insufficient, and also has very detrimental effects on people who are on a visa. People will lose funding. They will losing their jobs if they're working at the university and require the student status. So a lot of the inequalities that we've just heard about will be exacerbated by this leave of absence policy. So that's how pandemic PGRs kind of was founded, and we've since made efforts to organize PGRs on a UK-wide level and increase PGR representation within funding bodies, institutions, and their unions as well, because we found that very often we are valued as colleagues when it comes to the university's research output, but when we demand or require material assistance, we are put down as students, and basically we are told very often that we are not a priority, and stuff in the hierarchy of material support, PGRs basically came last. Our letter was signed by over 3,000 people, and we've kind of reached out to different PGR campaigns as well, and achieved to have a meeting with UKRI in August. We have not heard from the education ministers, by the way, but the UKRI have agreed to co-produce policies specifically around support for disabled PGRs, which we haven't heard back from yet, but that's one thing that we achieved. We also ran a survey with the University and College Union, and also a workshop with the University and College Union in summer to educate PGRs about their rights within the institution and their union. And we're also participating in 2 further UCU anti-casualisation trainings next week, actually, and to discuss some of the issues that came out of our survey and campaigning, especially for PGRs who teach. On the impact of the pandemic on postgraduate researchers, it's worth noting again that most institutions' ethics panels have shut down all face-to-face research since lockdown, and yet they demanded that projects will be amended to online research without initially making any commitments for extending the time for that or providing further funding for that work to be actually done. That put PGRs into a position where they had to continue their research as if nothing happened while the world was facing a global pandemic. Many institutions' support services were closed, which especially affected people, disabled PGRs and people who absolutely require the support services. And we've run a survey together with UCU where we found that PGRs who teach most of them did not receive any staff emails and also not any vital health and safety updates. They did not receive any training for online teaching, or where they did receive that, this training was often unpaid. We run, as an organizing drive, we run a survey as well, like trying to hear from PGRs across the country, and we found that 93% of PGRs reported that their work has been affected by the outbreak and lockdown, and 84% say that it will be either very difficult or impossible to adjust their research where required into like an adequate online format. The absence of any coherent approach to extensions and funding has meant that we've had colleagues in our meetings reaching out to us with crowdfunding initiatives to sustain themselves. We have had people facing homelessness, people doing their day job at night, as we've heard as well, because of caring responsibilities, and some institutions ask their students to write applications to wealthy alumni to have their research funded. When we look at like what kind of material support PGRs across the country were provided with, meaning laptops, internet connections, hardware, and space to actually do their research in an ethical way, it took most institutions over 6 months to get any system running for PGRs. And at several institutions, again, PGRs were told that they're not a priority because they're not staff. However, our research as PGRs is not something we do for fun or that charitable humanist institutions value because they're nice. It is actually labor, and it's valuable in a very materialist sense. PGR original research is given to companies for literally free to develop technology and products. Papers are given for free to publishing houses, and PGRs are an essential asset for a university's brand and getting investors. So this is why we argue that PGRs should be staff, actually, and definitely as a first step, PGRs need to get organized. We have, to that effect, we've brought, as a group, 2 motions to the UCU conference in autumn, where we established a principle that PGR research is to be seen as labor, and as the labor that it is, and that PGRs should be entitled to the same rights and benefits as all members of staff. And we committed UCU to include in their sector-wide negotiation with the employers the demand that all teaching must be contracted. So teaching that is required as part of a scholarship should be abolished, and all casual worker agreements should be replaced with a contract that includes workload allocation, paid parental and sick leave, etc. It seems very basic, but at the moment this is basically like, yeah, that's where we are at. And finally, yes, we've run an organizing workshop as pandemics PGRs just at the beginning of lockdown to increase the reach of our group and democracy within the group, because we basically want to strengthen PGR voice across the country and basically find a voice or like a platform that can bring together PGRs from all across the UK, because I think this pandemic has really shown that what we need is like a coherent strategy that applies for everybody and not like an individualist approach that tends to exacerbate the inequalities that are already existing in the sector. So that's pandemics PGRs. And I think I've maybe 2 links have been shared. One is to the event, to the training that UCU is putting on next week, and the other one is like a list of resources that came out of our previous workshop in summer that we ran together with the Anti-Casualization Committee. Stuff like know your rights as a PGR who teaches, and kind of useful links and bits and pieces. So have a look there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Elena. That was a really interesting kind of whistle-stop tour of a number of different campaigning angles and bits and pieces that things can get involved with via the links as well. So I think what we will try and do is play Nicola's video again. Hannah, if you're able to have another go at doing that, and if not, we'll go straight into the Q&A.
Hello. I want to tell you a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on doctoral and early career researchers. I'm Dr. Nicola Byrom. I'm a senior lecturer in psychology at King's, and I'm pre-recording this because Edith has played havoc with my ability to work during the lockdown. As my data shows you, my experience is not unique here. Early in the pandemic, there were concerns about the unequal impact of COVID-19 on scientists' ability to work. The impact has been felt most greatly by women and individuals with children aged between 0 and 11. In this data set, I'm trying to look at the experience of doctoral and early career researchers. This is a relatively large data set. It's relatively representative of the sample that we're looking at, the population that we're looking at, though we've overrepresented women in this sample. The study looked at mental distress and mental well-being. To look at mental distress, we've used the Kessler-6, which is a public health screening tool. This gives us an indication of what levels of mental health problems might be like in the population. It's not a clinical screening, it's used for public mental health. Anything on the left of the first purple bar says low levels of mental distress. That's what we'd like to see the whole population look like. Most of our sample are falling between those two purple bars, suggesting that this sample has mild to moderate levels of mental distress. This could be indicative of a mental health problem. Must note that that this data is just a snapshot, so I can't tell whether these problems have been caused by COVID, whether this level of mental distress is a response to COVID or might just be reflective of the population more generally, regardless of COVID. It might also be that individuals with mental health problems were more likely to be completing this survey. So we have to be careful about what this shows us and how we generalise this data to the population. However, within this data set, we did find that women were more likely to be reporting higher levels of mental distress and lower levels of mental well-being. So there's a clear gender effect going on. We've looked at a lot of qualitative data here to try and understand the challenges that people are experiencing, how that might then impact upon their mental health. This is a full list of the challenges that we identified. People were describing the impact of COVID-19. I want to focus in particular for you on increased pressure. And think about the causes, the sources of increased pressure that people were experiencing. So for some, the increased pressure was due to a need to redesign research projects due to a lack of access to resources. Researchers have also experienced increased workloads due to additional teaching, additional work associated with shifting teaching online, and additional demands to support students and the emotional labour that accompanies that. Some of the increased workload is being generated by skewed or imbalanced expectations, as some researchers have a lot more spare time to enable them to work, creating a sense of pressure for colleagues and collaborators. They feel they need to catch up, they need to keep up. For others, the increased pressure comes from blurred work-life boundaries, which create a challenge in accepting that one has done enough. Working from home, many are pushing themselves to work long hours and worrying about whether they are working hard enough on putting in enough hours. Poor distinction between work and home life can make it much easier to work very long hours and much harder to turn off. Others are finding it hard to accept limits, their limits and their reduced capacity to work due to caring requirements. These care requirements might be looking after children or other family members, and it's hard for people to say, actually, I can't work the hours that I'd normally work. I can't do it all. Some individuals did describe benefits. Around 50% of the respondents described a benefit. So it's important to note that these benefits aren't universally experienced, but there were some benefits in working online. Mostly this has been to do with having more time and more control over time, ability to think about how you allocate the time. We have looked at data also around suggestions that people were coming up with for how universities could support doctoral and early career researchers. So I just want to end with this wish list. This is what our sample was suggesting that universities should be doing to support their doctoral and early career researchers. If you'd like to find out more about the study, you can do so on the SMaRteN website, and I will ask Emily to share these slides with you. Thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Hannah, for sharing that fantastic presentation there from Nicola, and thank you to Nicola for pre-recording that for us. So we've heard from our three presenters covering kind of the experiences of early career researchers, and I wanted to now open the floor to you. So we have a few minutes for questions before we go into our breakout rooms. So I'd like to invite you to either pop a question in the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Hi, Daisy.
Hiya. So this is to both Emma and Elena. I enjoyed both of your presentations. They were both brilliant. I was just wondering what you would sort of, any thoughts on how we can support like PGRs who might be suffering with long COVID, because now this is becoming a reality for many people. Just sort of any ideas or suggestions on that. Thanks.
I don't know if Elena has anything to say. I suppose because it is a long-term and persistent health condition, I think that would fall under the eligibility for students' disabled allowance, I think, which is DSA, which is there to support PGRs and PhD students with long-term health conditions to be able to conduct their studies. There's normally only a very kind of strict list of things that you're eligible for, though, and so I'm not really sure how beneficial that would be. I guess one of the key problems that came out from PGRs that did have disabilities and long-term health conditions from my study was kind of the lack of support, I suppose, in that because everything's at home at the moment because of COVID, you can't have home visits. The support that you're supposed to be having, or the you know, like perhaps a more comfortable chair if you're really aching from long COVID or things like this, people weren't able to have those home visits. So I think one of the things that I'd really like to strengthen is a commitment to PGRs and ECRs with long-term health conditions and with disabilities to have that support they need, because that wouldn't really be acceptable in a workplace to not provide that equipment that's needed. But I don't know, again, PGRs kind of fall through the cracks a little bit with that.
I think just to add to that, I think in general, like the whole implications of like long COVID hasn't really been sinking into society's kind of consciousness, so to speak. I think we really need to probably rethink like how much work can we actually do at all, like what kind of working hours are reasonable and so forth, because I don't think, like, obviously, like, yeah, there are specific challenges as PGR and young career academic, but obviously that doesn't only apply to that sector, but like the whole of society. So I think like probably like a longer conversation and more like in-depth conversation about like how can we do work and how can we be more health aware in the way we structure work is probably needed.
May I ask a question? Okay, so my question is for Elena, actually, and excuse me if you've mentioned this already and I just kind of didn't pick up, but my brain is kind of a little bit fried right now. I was interested in the kind of the support you got from the unions. Like, how did you feel that relationship went? I guess that's the question.
I think, yeah, so we did have great allies in the university and college union, must say. So we've been reaching out specifically to the anti-casualization committee, and they've been very proactive and taking up those demands. Obviously, they have a tradition in like campaigning for casualized members. Like I think the thing that we kind of put back on the agenda was to kind of really rethinking the way PGRs are like classed within the education system, and they've since been in touch and to like the trainings that are run next week is like a direct result from that, but also they've been in touch to say like they are exploring with their sister union in Sweden, who just recently won recognition for PGRs as staff members, as members of staff, to explore what kind of legal implications such a change in status would mean. So it's obviously a long-term goal, but I think one worth exploring, and it's been really very positive in that regard.
Can I ask a question? Is that okay?
Please go ahead, Fiona. Yeah.
So I got my doctorate last year, so I'm an ECR, but I'm also a senior lecturer. So I've just put in a bid for a small amount of research at my university. But I think I'm very fortunate because I'm in a full-time permanent post. And I've got a bid where I need a research associate to help me with some work. But I think the problem with that is it's if I get the funding, it's 6 months, it's part-time, and actually one of the things that I really want to do if I get that person, is I then want to use that to then go and apply for larger grants. But it's a really perilous situation for that research associate, and there's nothing that I can really do about it other than keep putting the bids in and keep trying to get, and I think that's underlying a lot of this, isn't it? That is one of the most difficult situations, and I find it really frustrating because I'm kind of fueling that system by doing that, but I don't know what the alternative is.
Can I in on that? Just to say, like, yeah, I think it was hit the nail on the head, really, saying like, yeah, exactly, it's this whole structure of incentives that's kind of what Emily said as well, like, the academic sector is like structured by marketization and so forth. And I think the way to change that, I don't think like as individuals we can do very much, to be honest. I personally think like we're gonna have to get like collectively active. So I'd say like, yeah, probably the importance of unionization comes on in there. And then UCU has recently launched a Fund the Future campaign, which kind of asking for a fully funded university and higher education system. I think we should take that even further and say like we need free education on all levels, and kind of build our links with our sister unions, the NEU and so forth, and like the other campus unions, to make sure that everybody is kind of can play their part to the best of their abilities in education. And I think, yeah, but it's such a, like, again, that's a long-term goal, and I don't think like that's probably not an answer to like, oh, that specific problem, but I think it really points to how detrimental and to collegiality and all that kind of thing that marketized model of education really is.
Particularly because the bid itself, wants to hear about how you nurture ECRs, how you how you'll encourage capacity building and policy making for, clearly younger academics, and it just seems so. You're trying to fight the good fight with what the research is about, but actually how you fund the research is exactly the thing that perpetuates it. Let's hope I get the money anyway, and then we can do something with it.
Yeah, good luck. Good luck.
Can you feed that back to the funder? Because you're right, it's totally part of the... Can you hear me okay? My speaker on my computer's a bit crap. Did you hear what I said?
No, no. Sort of.
Okay, can you, if they, like, obviously not before you get the funding, but funders, in my experience, depending on the funder, do often sometimes want to improve their practice and know kind of what they do. And you're right, in some ways they're kind of perpetuating this casualization. It's not entirely their fault, but that model absolutely does. And so maybe if you get the money, you could be a person that says, in a casual, non-accusatory way, like, FYI, this setup is part of the problem, and I don't know if you're aware of it, or if there are ways around it. Maybe there aren't, but just to make you aware. I think it's a bit difficult, isn't it? Because
yeah, I mean, I would if I get the money, I would, and if I get the money, and if I don't get the money, I certainly will be. So yeah, it's but you sort of then you phrase it in the bid as it's a pilot study to see if this is something that's going to work, and you're even having to convince yourself that it's the right thing to do, and you're writing that you agree with it because it's a pilot study for 6 months, and if it works, then we'll get, then we'll apply for external funding. And I don't know what the answer is. It's just, I suppose it's being aware, and as you say, bit by bit, every time we do get a bit of funding or we don't get a bit of funding, feeding it back in, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's what I guess. There's also like Ella, my brain is absolutely fried, but there's also something about the institutional responsibility for people that it employs on a short-term basis.
Yeah,
but then that's part of the wider picture of casualisation, isn't it? So yeah. I think you're right, Elena, that we need to organise collectively. It's not just down to the individual problem or the individual researcher. That's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Definitely. Thank you, Jules. Thank you, Fiona. If there are any more questions, please do jump in now. Otherwise, we might go to the breakout rooms quickly. We'll have about sort of like 12 to 15 minutes for breakout rooms, people to kind of discuss these issues in slightly smaller groups. So if nobody has any further questions, okay, so Elena, Emily and myself kind of put our heads together, and we've grouped a few questions together under some different themes to help kind of direct a conversation around some of the kind of the themes that have already come out this afternoon. So the first one is reflecting upon challenges, which I think, yes, we'll probably have quite a few challenges that we could be reflecting on. How to share kind of best practice, and also some solutions for the future. What we'll do is we'll break into groups, and I will post the individual questions in the chat, and we'll invite you to please feel free to ignore them and carry on your own conversation around some of these issues if you prefer, but you can also follow some of the questions, pick up one of the themes or a question from each theme, whichever you prefer. So Hannah, if you are ready, I think we'll split into not too small groups, but small enough that everyone will have a chance to speak. And then we will all come back together at the end.
Okay, so I'm going to put